Flight 482 had just leveled off above the jagged Rockies, the sun casting golden streaks across snow-dusted peaks. Inside the cabin, the hum of conversation mixed with the faint whir of engines, the rhythmic rise and fall of passenger chatter creating the illusion of calm. Families settled into their long-haul routine. A child pressed her nose against the window, marveling at the mountains. An elderly couple whispered about their destination in Florida, and a businessman scrolled through emails on his tablet, oblivious to the beauty outside. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and blankets, their smiles calm, professional, almost rehearsed. At the front of the plane, Captain Reynolds, a man whose face carried the weight of 20 years navigating skis, ran through his mental checklist. Every instrument flickered green. The autopilot hummed softly. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Mark Daniels, young but meticulous, adjusted a knob, glanced at Reynolds and smiled. "Smooth flight today, sir," he said, the casual tone meant to break the monotony of hours in the air. Reynolds nodded, his eyes briefly scanning the horizon through the cockpit window. Then, without warning, a faint shiver ran down his spine. It started as a twitch in his left hand, subtle and almost unnoticeable. He tightened his grip on the yoke, thinking perhaps it was fatigue or maybe the early signs of a cold he hadn't admitted to himself. But then his chest tightened, a sudden, inexplicable pressure that made him gasp. His vision blurred, the instrument seeming to wobble as though the plane were tilting more than it was. Daniels noticed the change immediately. "Captain," he asked, leaning forward, "you okay?" Reynolds tried to respond, but his voice caught. His hand twitched, then dropped from the yoke. His eyes rolled back briefly, and then he slumped forward, hitting the edge of the control panel with a soft thud. The autopilot remained engaged, but the human element was gone, and in an instant the cabin became precariously dependent on a rookie co-pilot and a potentially catastrophic failure just feet away. "Captain," Daniels shouted, panic creeping into his voice. His hands hovered over the controls, indecision clawing at him. Reynolds was a legend in the squadron, someone who had faced engine failures, turbulence, and mechanical disasters, and yet here he was, suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. His chest rose in shallow, uneven gasps and then stopped altogether. In row 12B, a young nurse named Emily Lawson felt the first flicker of alarm. She had been dozing, exhausted after a 12-hour shift in the ER trying to catch some rest mid-flight. But her instincts, honed over years of treating emergencies in chaotic hospitals, screamed at her. She noticed the commotion at the front, lights flashing, a shadowed figure slumping, and something in her chest tightened with urgency. She pushed herself upright, eyes scanning the cabin. Flight attendants were frozen, their hands hovering over intercoms. A few passengers murmured nervously, some laughing it off, thinking it was a joke or a minor mishap. Emily didn't hesitate. She leaped from her seat, weaving through the narrow aisle, adrenaline igniting every muscle. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared the captain might hear it. She ignored the startled looks, the spilled coffee, the questions. Her training and her gut pushed her forward. She had dealt with unresponsive patients, heart attacks, and trauma, but never at 35,000 feet, where a single misstep could kill dozens. Reaching the cockpit, she pushed the door open, the co-pilot frozen in a mix of shock and fear. Reynolds' body slumped against the controls, pale and rigid. Emily's pulse accelerated. She assessed him rapidly. No response to voice, no pulse in the carotid, lips a ghostly blue. "CPR," she muttered under her breath, her hands finding the sternum, the rhythm she had drilled 1,000 times, now real, immediate, urgent. Daniels watched, wide-eyed, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way, his training insufficient for a situation like this. The plane shuddered slightly as it passed a pocket of turbulence, a reminder of how fragile their world had become. Passengers were unaware of the drama, their conversations oblivious, the ordinary bliss of in-flight comfort masking the chaos unfolding at the very front. Emily felt her hands begin to sweat, her strength taxed already, but she refused to pause. Each compression, each press was a lifeline. "Come on, sir," she whispered fiercely. "Stay with me." The co-pilot fumbled for the radio. "Mayday, mayday, medical emergency, captain unresponsive, requesting immediate assistance." His voice cracked. Emily barely registered it. Her focus was entirely on Reynolds. She rotated him gently, adjusted his head, and attempted to give him rescue breaths, but his chest remained still, stubbornly unresponsive. Fear gnawed at the edges of her mind. She had saved lives before, but never like this. Not thousands of feet above the ground, with the lives of hundreds dependent on a man she didn't even know personally. Time stretched painfully. Seconds became minutes. The plane's hum, the wind over the wings, the distant chatter of passengers, everything faded into a tunnel around her. Emily's vision narrowed. There was only Reynolds, only the rhythm of her hands against his chest, the desperate hope that she could coax life back into him. She glanced at Daniels, who nodded shakily, trusting her judgment implicitly, hands hovering over the yoke as if willing the autopilot to keep them steady. Then, as if in cruel trickery, Reynolds coughed once, a weak, rasping sound, and went limp again. Emily's stomach dropped. She swallowed bile, forced herself to continue, pushing down harder, faster. Sweat drenched her shirt, soaked her hair, and yet she didn't stop. Her mind raced through every possible scenario: oxygen masks, turbulence, emergency landing, paramedics on the tarmac. But the only thing that mattered was the captain's chest rising, the pulse returning, the spark of life that would prevent disaster. Outside the cockpit window, the Rockies loomed like silent, indifferent witnesses to the struggle inside. The sunlight glinted off jagged peaks, oblivious to the drama unfolding at 35,000 feet. Emily glanced briefly at the autopilot. Green lights blinked in the corner, but she knew the machine could not do everything. Only human hands, trained and desperate, could keep Reynolds alive. Behind her, the passengers began to murmur, a few noticing the odd commotion near the cockpit. Flight attendants moved quickly now, some rushing to assist, others trying to maintain calm. Emily didn't notice. She was lost in the rhythm of compressions, breaths, and urgent whispers. Every second was life or death. Every second could tilt the balance between tragedy and survival. A sudden jolt rocked the plane. Turbulence, minor but enough to send adrenaline spiking further. Emily steadied herself, adjusting Reynolds' position without breaking the CPR rhythm. Her mind screamed at her to stay calm, to focus, but panic tried to claw in. "Not yet," she whispered fiercely, ignoring the tremor in her own hands. "Not now, stay with me." And in that suspended moment, the fate of Flight 482 and everyone aboard hung by a single thread, as a nurse in 12B fought against impossible odds, racing against death itself, with the mountains below and the endless sky above. Emily's hands pounded against Captain Reynolds' chest, every compression a desperate plea for life. The co-pilot, Daniels, was white-knuckled, eyes darting between the yoke and Emily's hands. The autopilot steadied the plane, but the human element was dangerously absent. Turbulence rocked the cabin intermittently, rattling overhead bins and sending a stack of magazines tumbling to the floor. The passengers, initially oblivious, now sensed something was wrong. Murmurs swelled to whispers, whispers to nervous chatter, and finally to outright panic. In row 14, a young mother clutched her toddler, eyes wide as she noticed flight attendants frantically moving toward the cockpit. A businessman in 18C fumbled with his phone, trying to call the airline, the text messages left unsent in his panic. An elderly couple in 16D and 16E held each other tightly, whispering prayers. Some passengers thought it was a joke. Some assumed a sudden illness had struck someone, but the tension was tangible, crawling along the aisles like an invisible storm. Emily barely registered the chaos. Her focus was entirely on Reynolds' lifeless body. She checked his pulse repeatedly, feeling a faint flicker, a whisper of circulation, and then nothing again. Panic threatened to surge, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus, to keep him alive. "Stay with me," she murmured, each word a lifeline tossed across the chasm between death and survival. She rotated him gently, adjusted his head to open the airway, and delivered measured rescue breaths. Daniels watched her with awe and fear. unsure how someone could remain so calm while the captain's life teetered on the edge. A sudden thump rattled the cockpit door and a flight attendant's voice called urgently, "Ma'am, can we help? Do you need anything?" Emily didn't even look up, her mind a singular tunnel. Keep Reynolds alive, keep the plane stable. She barked out orders without thinking, oxygen mask, pull the manual supplies, Daniels, we need to keep him upright if possible. Her voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the panic like a lighthouse beam. The flight attendants complied instantly, adrenaline overriding their own fear. Meanwhile, turbulence intensified. The plane shuddered violently, the wings flexing under the strain. Passengers screamed, some gripping armrests, others clutching their neighbors. Drinks spilled, trays slid across the floor, and the roar of panic mingled with the engine's deep growl. Emily felt herself sway with each movement, but she anchored herself to the captain's body, adjusting her stance to maintain control. Every second stretched infinitely, every heartbeat a fragile thread. Daniel's hands shook as he gripped the yoke, following the autopilot's guidance but aware that nothing in his training had prepared him for this. He looked at Emily, who was sweating, white-faced yet unyielding. "How are you still so calm?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of engines and screams. Emily's eyes didn't leave Reynolds. "I have to be," she said simply. "If I panic, he dies. If you panic, we all die." Daniel swallowed hard, understanding the gravity of every word. Back in the cabin, a nervous energy began to ripple through passengers. The smell of fear mixed with recycled air. A teenage boy in 20F whispered to his sister, "What's happening?" She shrugged, gripping the armrest tightly, eyes fixed on the cockpit door. A flight attendant tried to calm the crowd, her voice shaking, "Please remain seated. Please stay calm. Medical emergency in the cockpit." But words couldn't mask the fear. Humans sense danger faster than explanations. Every face reflected the same question. Were they about to die? Emily continued compressions, feeling exhaustion creep into her muscles, her arms trembling under the strain. She knew she couldn't stop, even for a moment, not when the captain's life was hanging by a thread. She barked again, "Daniels, we need more oxygen. Check the manual override." The co-pilot's hands flew over switches and levers, flipping valves and adjusting airflow. The cockpit was a storm of controlled chaos, flashing lights, buttons, levers, and a single human heart in peril. Then came the first flicker of hope. Reynolds gasped, a weak, shuddering breath that sent Emily's pulse racing. She pressed harder, faster, urging more life back into him. The co-pilot glanced at her, eyes wide. "He's breathing, but barely." Emily didn't respond immediately, her focus narrowing to the faint rise and fall of his chest. Every nerve in her body screamed both relief and alarm. He was alive, but for how long? One misstep, one moment's hesitation, and it could all collapse. The plane hit another turbulent spike, violently pitching left, throwing unbuckled passengers into seats and spilling more drinks. Emily barely held on, balancing herself against the captain as she maintained compressions. Her shirt was soaked with sweat, her arms trembling, but she didn't stop. Every muscle, every heartbeat was devoted to one purpose: keep him alive. Daniels adjusted the autopilot to compensate for the sudden jolt, his own heart hammering in his chest. The cockpit was alive with tension, a symphony of fear, skill, and raw human determination. Then came the moment Emily had been dreading. A warning light flashed, engine pressure dropping slightly on the right side. Daniel's voice cracked as he said, "I've got turbulence, oxygen issues, and now an engine alert." Emily's mind raced. They were trapped in the air, thousands of feet above unforgiving mountains, with a critically ill captain, an inexperienced co-pilot, and hundreds of terrified passengers. She gritted her teeth and pressed harder on Reynolds' chest. "Not now," she whispered. "You're staying with me, Captain. You hear me?" A low murmur began to ripple through the cabin as more passengers noticed the commotion. Phones were raised, messages typed frantically, videos secretly recorded. Some passengers prayed aloud, others cried silently. Every second the tension mounted. Emily could feel it like a physical weight pressing on her shoulders, but she didn't let it touch her resolve. She had a life to save and nothing else mattered. Minutes stretched, each one an eternity. Emily rotated Reynolds slightly, repositioned his head, and delivered another round of rescue breaths. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she refused to blink. The co-pilot's voice came again, steadying himself. "We're going to land this plane. We're going to make it." Emily's eyes flicked to him briefly, and she nodded. Together, they were a lifeline for Reynolds, holding him against the abyss. And then, as the plane leveled slightly, a faint groan emerged from Reynolds' throat, a sound so weak, so fleeting, that it could have been mistaken for the wind outside. Emily leaned in, heart hammering. "That's it. Keep going," she murmured. "You're alive. Just keep fighting." The co-pilot's hand steadied, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm of fear. But Emily knew better than to relax. He could slip away at any second, and the lives of hundreds depended on her composure. From 12B to the cockpit, a single nurse had become the axis upon which survival turned. Every passenger, every light flicker, every shudder of the plane was now background to the fight for a man's life. And as Emily continued compressions, guiding weak breaths into the captain's lungs, the storm outside mirrored the storm inside. The turbulence, the fear, the uncertainty. Seconds became minutes, minutes became lifetimes. And in that suspended moment, Flight 482 hung in the balance, a soaring vessel tethered by courage, desperation, and a nurse who refused to let life slip away. The cockpit was a storm of movement and noise. Emily's hands never left Captain Reynolds' chest as she pressed and released, measured, urgent, commanding. His pulse flickered like a dying candle, a fragile rhythm she fought to keep alive. Each compression was a battle, a plea, a desperate negotiation with fate. Sweat ran down her temples, stinging her eyes, but she refused to slow. Every second mattered. Every second could be the difference between life and death. Daniel's knuckles were white as he gripped the yoke, eyes darting to the autopilot indicators, gauges, and the faint flicker of Reynolds' weak pulse. He tried to focus, tried to follow protocol, but nothing in his flight school textbooks could have prepared him for this. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm, relying on Emily's steady presence like a lifeline. "We've got to stabilize him," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the cockpit's chaos. "Help me with the oxygen." The plane shuddered violently as it passed through turbulence again, a violent gust rattling the fuselage. Outside the cockpit windows, jagged clouds clawed at the sunlight, lightning flashing far below the wings. Emily barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to the captain and the rhythm of his failing heartbeat. She shifted her stance slightly to compensate for the plane's tilt, adjusting Reynolds' head, delivering shallow breaths, counting compressions silently under her breath. She thought of her father, lost to a heart attack years ago, and the bitter helplessness she had once felt. Now she had a chance to rewrite that narrative, to fight against death in the air. Back in the cabin, panic was spreading like wildfire. Passengers clutched each other, phones held high as videos recorded the unfolding drama. Children whimpered, some crying outright, while parents struggled to maintain calm facades. A flight attendant's voice trembled as she tried to soothe the growing fear. "Please remain seated. Everything is under control." The words rang hollow, even to herself. She knew they were barely holding onto the illusion of safety. Emily ignored the chaos. Her hands pounded rhythmically against Reynolds' chest, the compressions echoing in her mind like a drumbeat of urgency. She rotated him slightly, repositioned his head, and forced breaths into his lungs. Then for a brief, miraculous second, he groaned, a low, rasping sound that made her heart leap. She pressed harder, willing life back into his body, refusing to let the fragile spark die. Daniels leaned closer, his voice shaking. He's responding, just barely. But hope was a fragile thing. Reynolds' pulse faltered again, weak, intermittent, like the flickering of a streetlight in a storm. Emily's stomach tightened with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. She barked instructions to Daniels, coordinating each move, oxygen adjustments, slight elevation of the captain's torso, monitoring the autopilot. Every decision mattered. Outside, the plane shook violently again as a sudden turbulence spike hit. Drinks spilled in the cabin, luggage rattled, and a collective gasp rose from passengers as the plane wobbled. Emily's mind raced through contingency plans, each one more terrifying than the last. What if the captain flatlined entirely? What if Daniels couldn't manage the plane under stress? She had never performed emergency procedures at 35,000 feet with hundreds of lives in the balance. Her hands ached, muscles trembling, sweat soaking her clothes, but she pushed herself harder, faster. She counted compressions silently. 1, 2, 3, 60, 61, 62. The rhythm became a mantra, a tether to reality, a defiance against the chaos surrounding them. Daniel's voice cracked again as he tried to maintain control. "I'm getting altitude warnings. I'm adjusting, oh God, oh God." Emily snapped her head toward him. "Focus on the plane, I've got him," she shouted, her voice fierce, commanding, a rope pulling him from the brink of panic. He swallowed, nodded, and focused, hands steadying over the yoke, breathing controlled as he guided the autopilot through minor corrections. Outside the cockpit window, lightning split the sky, casting jagged shadows across the clouds. It was like the universe itself was testing them, daring them to fail. Emily felt herself sway slightly as the plane lurched again, but she didn't stop. She checked Reynolds' pulse repeatedly, adjusting her compressions as needed. His eyes fluttered weakly, the faintest spark of consciousness, and she whispered fiercely, "Stay with me, sir. You're stronger than this. Come back to me." The words were barely audible, but they carried everything: desperation, command, hope, and fear. Then suddenly an alarm blared from the cockpit panel, a minor hydraulic warning. Daniel's face paled. "Now this," he muttered, gripping the controls like a lifeline. Emily's heart pounded even harder. She had trained for emergencies, yes, but this combination, unresponsive captain, turbulence, failing systems, hundreds of lives, was unprecedented. Every instinct screamed that failure could come at any second. She didn't hesitate. She barked instructions to Daniels, guiding him as she maintained compressions, coordinating oxygen flow and minor cockpit adjustments. The minutes dragged, stretching impossibly long. Emily's mind cycled through every possible outcome, every scenario. She thought of her patients, her colleagues, her family. She thought of Reynolds' wife, his children, the lives tethered to the choices made in that cockpit. And yet, amidst the chaos, her focus remained razor-sharp. She knew that panic would kill them faster than any turbulence or mechanical fault. Then came the first sign of hope. Reynolds coughed weakly, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the whine of the engines. Emily's heart leapt. She pressed harder, synchronizing compressions with his shallow breaths, willing strength back into his body. Daniels leaned closer, voice shaking. "He's breathing. He's actually breathing." Emily didn't allow herself relief yet. It was fragile, tenuous, like ice on a lake, beautiful, promising, but capable of breaking at any moment. Outside, the storm worsened. Clouds churned like angry oceans, lightning flashing far below the wings. Passengers gripped each other, unaware of the miracle unfolding in the cockpit. Every second was a collision of fear, hope, and sheer human will. Emily's hands ached, her lungs burned, but she refused to stop. She had one mission: keep Reynolds alive until they could land. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in a blur of compression, shallow breaths, and whispered commands. Reynolds' chest began to rise more steadily, his pulse flickering with slightly more strength. Emily leaned close, whispering words of encouragement, willing him to stay with her. "You're stronger than this. You can fight. You have to fight. Not yet, not now." Daniels adjusted the yoke slightly, every muscle tense, every decision critical. The plane leveled, but turbulence continued to shake them unpredictably. Suddenly, another warning light flashed, oxygen pressure dropping. Daniel's voice rose in panic again, but Emily kept her composure. "Manual override, now," she shouted, guiding him through the procedure as her hands never left Reynolds' chest. Sweat burned her eyes, muscles screamed in protest, and yet she pushed harder, faster, refusing to yield to exhaustion. Then, almost imperceptibly, Reynolds groaned again, a weak, shuddering sound enough to confirm life. Emily's heart surged, a mixture of relief and fear washing over her. He was alive, but barely. Every nerve screamed that they were not safe yet. Every ounce of strength had to remain focused, for one false move could undo everything. And in that suspended, heart-pounding moment, the fate of Flight 482 of Captain Reynolds, of hundreds of souls aboard, hung by a thread, a fragile tapestry of courage, skill, and sheer human determination. Emily's hands were still pressed against his chest, the rhythm of survival echoing in her mind. The cockpit was a storm of lights, alarms, turbulence, and fear, but within it a single thread of hope persisted. And as the plane continued its flight through the roiling clouds, Emily knew one thing with certainty. Every second from here on would be a battle against time, gravity, and the fragile hold between life and death. The autopilot hummed steadily, but the tension in the cockpit was electric, a living entity that clung to every surface. Outside, the storm thickened, the jagged clouds now heavy with rain that lashed against the windshield in relentless sheets. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes, illuminating the mountains below in stark, ghostly white. Turbulence rattled the plane violently, each jolt a cruel reminder that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Every second, every decision, could be the difference between life and death. Emily's hands never left Captain Reynolds. She continued compressions, counted each rhythm silently, her focus absolute. The captain's pulse had returned, weak but perceptible, but his breathing remained shallow, inconsistent. Every cough, every flutter of his eyelids was a fragile reminder that he was hanging by a thread. Emily rotated his head slightly, adjusted the oxygen mask, and whispered commands to keep him alert, murmuring reassurance while her own adrenaline surged. She could feel her muscles trembling, fatigue clawing at her, but she refused to surrender. Lieutenant Daniels adjusted the yoke repeatedly, flying the plane manually through the turbulence, trying to keep a steady descent toward a distant airport that ATC had identified. His hands shook, jaw tight, sweat trickling down the side of his face. The autopilot could stabilize altitude and heading, but only human decision-making could navigate the treacherous crosswinds, sudden downdrafts, and storm bursts. He cast nervous glances at Emily, who remained a pillar of determination. "He's alive." "Thanks to you," he muttered, voice tight with emotion and awe. Emily gave a brief nod but didn't relax. She couldn't, not yet. In the cabin, the passengers were beginning to realize that this flight was far from ordinary. The turbulence grew more violent, sending beverages spilling across trays and luggage thudding to the floor. Some screamed outright, clutching seats or praying aloud, while others sat frozen in disbelief. Flight attendants, trying to maintain composure, were now frantically moving down the aisles, trying to calm passengers while preparing emergency equipment. Every face was painted with fear, every movement a silent testament to their shared anxiety. Back in the cockpit, Emily's hands worked with precision and urgency. She monitored the captain's pulse, his eyes flickering open, his skin pale and his breathing shallow. She whispered his name, giving verbal cues to encourage consciousness, adjusting the oxygen mask and airflow. "Come on, sir," she urged, her voice firm yet gentle. "I need you with me. Don't give up now." The co-pilot's eyes darted between instruments and Emily's work, witnessing the seamless coordination of human courage and medical knowledge in real time. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, a sharp drop that sent Emily sliding slightly against Reynolds' body. Daniels shouted over the roar of engines and wind, "We've got a downdraft. Brace for turbulence." Emily adjusted immediately, pressing herself firmly against the captain, continuing compressions without pause. She felt the plane's engine strain against the storm, felt the tremor of aluminum and hydraulics under her hands. Every sense screamed danger, every second a reminder that the world outside could collapse in an instant. Emily rotated Reynolds gently, repositioning his head and shoulders to maintain airway alignment while simultaneously compressing his chest. His pulse remained faint but detectable, a fragile lifeline she refused to relinquish. The co-pilot adjusted altitude, banking slightly to avoid a towering cumulonimbus cloud. Rain lashed the windows, lightning illuminating the cockpit in surreal, stark bursts. Emily's eyes flicked briefly toward the storm outside, then back to Reynolds, her entire world concentrated in the rhythm of life she fought to sustain. A sudden crackle of static over the radio signaled the air traffic control officer's voice. "Flight 482, you are cleared for emergency descent. Recommend immediate landing. Status of captain." Daniels swallowed hard and relayed the situation, his voice controlled despite the fear lurking beneath. Emily glanced at him sharply. "We need to descend carefully. No sudden movements. I've got Reynolds, he's alive but weak. We cannot risk sudden turbulence killing him outright." The co-pilot nodded, gripping the controls tighter. Each adjustment was meticulous, every minor change in pitch or roll measured and deliberate. Outside, the mountains jutted sharply from the mist, the jagged peaks illuminated briefly by flashes of lightning. Every cloud seemed alive, threatening, almost sentient, as if the storm itself sought to punish the plane for daring to pass through its domain. Emily's heart pounded as she adjusted Reynolds again, giving shallow breaths and continuing compressions in perfect rhythm. Minutes stretched endlessly. Emily could feel fatigue clawing at her limbs, her arms burning from the relentless compressions, sweat stinging her eyes, yet she refused to stop. She reminded herself that the captain's life and hundreds of others depended on her endurance. "You're coming back," she whispered fiercely. "You're not leaving me. Stay with me. Breathe. Fight." Her words were both a command and a plea, infused with desperation, fear, and unwavering resolve. The plane jolted sharply again, turbulence tossing it like a leaf in a storm. Daniel's hands moved frantically over the controls, fighting crosswinds and downdrafts, keeping the autopilot and the aircraft's systems in delicate balance. Outside, the storm darkened further, the once golden light of the sun now hidden behind a wall of thick, roiling clouds. Passengers gripped armrests, prayers spilling from mouths, fear etched deep in eyes. Flight attendants shouted instructions, their voices barely audible over the roar. Emily's hands remained steadfast on Reynolds, every compression deliberate, every breath delivered with care. She monitored his pulse repeatedly, noting the faint flickers of life, the subtle shifts in color, the slight rise and fall of his chest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, strength began returning. A weak cough, a flutter of eyelids, the shallow exhale of life that made Emily's chest tighten with hope, yet fear remained. Every second could undo their fragile progress. Daniel's voice broke the momentary silence, strained but resolute. "We're approaching the designated airport. I'm maintaining descent. Keep him stable." Emily adjusted the oxygen, rotated the captain slightly, whispered his name, and continued compressions. Outside, lightning illuminated a distant ridge, rain lashing violently against the fuselage, wind howling around the wings. Every jolt sent a spike of fear through her, yet she remained immovable, a single pillar of courage in the maelstrom. Then came the sudden realization. Reynolds' pulse was stronger now, faintly regular. A shallow groan escaped his throat. Emily's heart leapt. She pressed even harder, coaxing his body into sustained rhythm. "That's it, sir, that's it. Fight with me, stay with me. You're alive, but we're not done yet." Daniels adjusted the yoke slightly, avoiding a sudden updraft. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside, both relentless, both threatening, yet the fragile glimmer of hope persisted. And in that moment, suspended between life and death, between storm and calm, Flight 482 raced toward its emergency landing. Emily's hands never wavered, the rhythm of compressions a silent testament to her courage, determination, and unwavering will to save the man before her. Every passing second was a battle against gravity, wind, fear, and time. And though the storm raged outside, inside the cockpit, a fragile, hard-won rhythm of survival had emerged, a tether that might just carry them through the darkness to safety. The plane cut through the storm like a blade, rain pelting the fuselage with relentless fury. Emily's hands never left Captain Reynolds, pressing, rotating, adjusting, guiding each shallow breath. His pulse, once a weak flicker, now thumped faintly in rhythm with her compressions. It was fragile, tenuous, but alive. Each gasp, each flutter of his eyelids, became a lifeline against the storm that raged both outside and inside the cockpit. Daniel's knuckles whitened around the yoke. "We're clear of the worst clouds for now," he announced, voice tight. "But crosswinds ahead, strong gusts, brace for turbulence." Emily nodded, her focus absolute. She was acutely aware of every jolt, every tremor of the plane, and the fragile balance of Reynolds' life. Outside, the mountains receded into gray mist, the storm still brooding, indifferent to the lives inside its grasp. Emily rotated the captain carefully, adjusting the oxygen mask over his pale face. Each breath she gave him seemed to strengthen him, a tiny miracle in motion. She could feel life returning slowly, a fragile warmth beneath her hands. "You're stronger than you think," she murmured, almost to herself. "Come on, sir, I need you with me." Her voice was steady, commanding, infused with the urgency of someone who knew that hesitation now could mean disaster. In the cabin, passengers had begun to notice a shift. The screaming and panic were still present, but a subtle tension of hope threaded through the rows. Flight attendants moved with more purpose, adjusting passengers' seat belts, helping the frightened brace for landing. Phones recorded trembling hands and anxious faces, capturing the storm outside, the chaos inside, and the remarkable heroism unfolding just feet away in the cockpit. Emily's arms burned with fatigue, sweat stinging her eyes, but she refused to relent. Every muscle, every nerve was focused on maintaining Reynolds' fragile heartbeat. She checked his eyes. They flickered, weakly tracking her movements, a faint consciousness returning. Her pulse raced in tandem with his, a silent duet of life and will. Daniels glanced over at her, awestruck. "I've never seen anything like this," he said quietly, almost reverent. "He's alive because of you." Emily didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. There was too much at stake. Lightning illuminated the storm outside, revealing jagged peaks and rolling clouds. The plane lurched violently, forcing Daniels to make rapid adjustments. Emily leaned with the movement, compressions never pausing, breaths delivered meticulously. Each second was a battle, against time, against nature, against death itself. She felt a sudden spark of hope when the captain's pulse strengthened slightly, enough that she dared to adjust the rhythm of compressions. "Steady, steady," she whispered. "Breathe, sir. Keep breathing. You're coming back." Daniel's hands moved deftly over the controls, making minute corrections to maintain altitude and heading. The storm outside seemed almost sentient, challenging them at every turn, but Emily's focus remained unbroken. She was the tether keeping Reynolds' life anchored, a lifeline in a cockpit storm that threatened to consume everything. Minutes passed like hours. Emily's arms shook, muscles screaming in protest, but she refused to pause. She rotated Reynolds again, delivering breaths and compressions in perfect rhythm. Outside, the storm intensified briefly, lightning crackling across the clouds, illuminating the rain-soaked fuselage. A passenger's gasp echoed through the cabin. Emily barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to the captain, his pulse, and the fragile thread of life she refused to let snap. Suddenly, Reynolds coughed weakly, a small, almost imperceptible sound. Emily's heart leapt. "There it is," she whispered, pressing harder, faster, encouraging every flicker of life. Daniels adjusted the yoke slightly, compensating for a sudden gust of wind. Outside, the storm remained unyielding, yet within the cockpit, a fragile miracle was taking shape. Reynolds' chest rose and fell with slightly more strength, each breath a defiance against the odds. Emily's thoughts flashed to her patients, to her father who she had lost to a sudden heart attack, to every life she had tried to save. The memory of helplessness she had felt years ago fueled her resolve now. She refused to let that helplessness happen again. Not here, not at 35,000 feet, not with Reynolds clinging to life in front of her. "You're not leaving me," she whispered fiercely. "Stay with me. You're going to make it." Daniels glanced at the instruments, then back at Emily. "We're approaching the emergency landing airport," he said, voice tight with relief. Emily nodded briefly, then returned to Reynolds, adjusting his oxygen mask, monitoring pulse and breathing and continuing compressions. Outside, the runway lights glimmered faintly through the storm, a distant promise of safety. But the approach would not be simple. Gusts of wind, low visibility, and the captain's fragile state made every maneuver perilous. The co-pilot's voice broke the tense rhythm. "Wind shear detected. Sudden gusts on final approach." Emily's hands clenched as the plane rocked violently. "Keep steady," she shouted, her own voice cutting through the roar of engines and storm. She leaned firmly against Reynolds, compressions unbroken, breaths precise, guiding him as though sheer will could carry him through the chaos. The cockpit was a symphony of terror and hope, each note fraught with life-or-death stakes. Emily's pulse raced in tandem with the captain's faint heartbeat. Each flutter, Each gasp of breath became a thread of hope woven into the fabric of survival. She adjusted his posture, whispered encouragement, and continued compressions, her body a conduit of determination and skill. Daniel's hands flew over the controls, responding to wind gusts, adjusting for sudden altitude shifts, and guiding the plane toward the faint lights of the emergency runway. Time became both ally and enemy. Every second brought Reynolds closer to stability, yet every second carried the risk of sudden collapse. Emily's mind raced, calculating, anticipating, reacting. Her entire being was devoted to maintaining the fragile rhythm of life beneath her hands. Outside, lightning illuminated the mountains briefly, each flash revealing the precipitous terrain below. A miscalculation, a sudden downdraft, or even a momentary lapse could be catastrophic. And then against the storm, against fatigue, against impossible odds, a miracle emerged. Reynolds' chest rose and fell steadily. A weak but audible cough escaped him. Emily's heart soared. She pressed harder, urging him to stay conscious, to fight alongside her. Daniels adjusted the yoke carefully, banking slightly to avoid turbulence while maintaining the approach. The runway lights grew brighter, a faint promise of survival piercing the storm. In the cockpit, time slowed. Emily's hands never wavered, compressions steady, breaths precise. The storm raged outside, passengers gripped their armrests and flight attendants whispered prayers, but inside a fragile rhythm of life had emerged, a miracle born of courage, determination, and relentless skill. Reynolds' pulse strengthened slightly, each beat a defiance against death. Emily whispered again, "You're alive, keep fighting, you're coming back to us." And in that suspended, heart-pounding moment, Flight 482 barreled toward the runway. The storm's fury continued, the plane pitched and shuddered, yet a fragile thread of hope persisted. Emily's hands pressed rhythmically against the captain's chest, every breath, every pulse, a defiance against fate itself. And as the runway lights grew ever closer, a single truth became clear. Miracles were possible, but only for those willing to fight with everything they had. The plane trembled violently, lurching like a wounded bird through the storm-tossed sky. Rain lashed the fuselage with unrelenting fury, wind shrieking past the cockpit windows, and lightning illuminated the jagged mountains below. Emily's hands stayed locked on Captain Reynolds' chest, each compression a desperate plea against death. His pulse had strengthened marginally, a fragile thread, but every flutter was precarious. She whispered urgently, "Come on, sir, stay with me. Not yet, not now." Daniel's eyes were wide with tension, his hands a blur on the yoke as he fought to maintain control. The runway lights were just beginning to pierce the storm's darkness in the distance, a faint promise of salvation, but the turbulence was brutal. Wind shear increasing. He shouted over the roar of the engines, voice tight. Emily rotated Reynolds slightly, adjusted the oxygen mask, and continued compressions, coordinating every movement like a symphony of life and skill. One wrong adjustment, one lapse of focus could undo everything. The storm outside seemed almost sentient, as if aware of the fragile thread of survival within the cockpit. Lightning split the sky, casting harsh, flickering shadows over Emily's sweat-streaked face. Rain hammered the windshield in torrents, creating a blur of gray and white. The plane jolted violently again, forcing Daniels to bank sharply. Emily gritted her teeth, holding Reynolds firmly in place while keeping compression steady, refusing to let the motion shake her rhythm. Emily could feel the life slowly returning to Reynolds. His eyelids fluttered, a faint, struggling consciousness emerging. A weak cough escaped his lips and his pulse gained strength, a flicker of victory, but the danger was far from over. "That's it, sir. Keep fighting. You're almost there," she murmured, her voice low but commanding. Daniels adjusted the plane's descent, every twitch of the yoke precise, every correction deliberate, as he guided them through turbulence and wind gusts toward the faint glow of the emergency runway. Suddenly an alarm blared, hydraulic pressure dropping in the left wing. Daniels froze, heart pounding. "Hydraulic system failing," he shouted, voice tight with fear. Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't stop compressions. "Keep him alive," she snapped, voice fierce. "I've got Reynolds, you keep this plane steady. Focus now." Daniel's hands flew over switches, toggling manual overrides, praying that his rapid corrections would compensate for the failing system. Outside, lightning struck nearby, the plane jolting violently again. The captain's pulse remained weak but steady, each beat a fragile victory. Emily's muscles burned, her lungs screamed, but she refused to falter. She whispered constantly, coaxing life back into him. "You're stronger than this. You're coming back. I need you awake. I need you here." Her voice was fierce, commanding, and compassionate all at once, a tether between Reynolds and the abyss of unconsciousness. Turbulence battered the aircraft once more. Daniels adjusted the plane's bank, carefully maneuvering to avoid the worst of the gusts. The rain and wind created a wall outside, visibility nearly zero. Emily adjusted Reynolds' position again, pressing breaths into his lungs with precision, monitoring his pulse. His chest rose slowly, a sign of survival, yet every second was still a gamble against the storm, against the failing hydraulics, against the limits of human endurance. In the cabin, passengers gripped armrests and prayed silently. Flight attendants moved quickly, tense and urgent, guiding those who could see the approaching lights and preparing for a difficult landing. The roar of engines, the howl of wind, and the clatter of loose items merged into a cacophony of fear. Phones captured trembling hands and anxious faces. Yet none of them knew that the most critical battle was unfolding just feet away in the cockpit, a battle of skill, courage, and sheer will. Emily leaned close to Reynolds, adjusting his oxygen mask and monitoring his weak pulse. She could feel life returning, a faint warmth under her hands, but she couldn't relax. Every second was precious. "You're almost there," she whispered. "I need you awake. We're almost safe, just a little longer." The captain's eyes fluttered weakly, a glimmer of awareness returning. Each beat of his heart was a testament to her determination, a fragile promise that life could prevail even in the harshest circumstances. Daniels glanced at the runway lights now, faintly shimmering through the storm. "I see it. Hold steady," he said, voice tight with concentration. Emily adjusted Reynolds slightly, pressed a breath into his lungs, and continued compressions. Every movement was precise, deliberate, choreographed by urgency and necessity. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howled, and the rain continued to hammer the plane, yet within the cockpit, a fragile rhythm of survival persisted. Suddenly, the plane shuddered violently. Another gust caught them off guard, forcing Daniels to make a rapid correction. Emily felt herself sway, muscles burning, but she refused to pause. She gritted her teeth, continued compressions, whispered encouragement to Reynolds, and coordinated every move with precision. The hydraulic warning continued to flash, a cruel reminder that the aircraft itself was now part of the danger they faced. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. Emily's hands ached, her body screaming for rest, but she refused. Every pulse, every breath, every flutter of the captain's eyes demanded her full attention. She whispered softly, fiercely, coaxing him back to life. "You're stronger than this. Come on, stay with me. Not yet, not now." Daniels maneuvered the plane with trembling precision, compensating for gusts, turbulence, and the failing hydraulic system. Then, almost imperceptibly, Reynolds' pulse stabilized further. His breathing, though shallow, became more consistent. A weak groan escaped him. Emily's heart leapt. She pressed harder, faster, coaxing more strength from him. "That's it, sir. Stay awake. Fight with me," she urged. Outside, the runway lights grew brighter, a faint promise of safety piercing the storm. Daniels adjusted the controls carefully, preparing for the final approach despite the still volatile winds. The cockpit was a storm of tension, hope, and determination. Emily's hands never wavered, compressions relentless, breaths precise. Reynolds' pulse strengthened and life was returning, but the plane was still at the mercy of the storm and the failing hydraulics. Each gust, each flash of lightning, each sudden jolt could undo everything. Yet the trio, Emily, Daniels, and the fragile captain, continued to fight, tethered together by courage, skill, and the unyielding human will to survive. And in that suspended, heart-pounding moment, Flight 482 hurtled toward the runway, every second a battle between life and death, every heartbeat a fragile promise of survival. Emily whispered again, softly, fiercely, "You're alive. Keep fighting. We're almost there." The storm raged, the wind howled, and the plane trembled, but hope, fragile and luminous, persisted, guiding them toward the final, perilous moments before landing. The runway lights grew brighter through the downpour, cutting a faint, trembling path through the storm. Emily's hands never left Captain Reynolds, each compression a desperate rhythm, each breath a whispered command for life. His pulse had stabilized just enough to suggest hope, but he was still perilously weak. One misstep, one sudden gust, and everything could collapse. The storm screamed against the fuselage, wind and rain hammering relentlessly, a furious trial of survival. Daniel's jaw was tight, knuckles white on the yoke as he guided the plane through the final approach. Each adjustment was delicate, precise, a dance between control and chaos. The plane rocked violently with every gust, and hydraulics continued to falter, warning lights flickering as though mocking their efforts. Emily leaned into Reynolds, compression steady, whispering fiercely, "Stay with me. Almost there, just a little longer." The plane dipped suddenly, a violent roll catching them off guard. Daniels shouted, "Wind shear, brace for sudden descent." Emily pressed harder, holding Reynolds firmly, her muscles screaming under the strain, but she didn't stop. Outside, the runway flashed closer, a shimmering lifeline cutting through sheets of rain. The passengers, unaware of the miraculous struggle in the cockpit, clutched their seats, some praying silently, some weeping, all gripped by fear. Emily's focus was absolute. She monitored Reynolds' pulse, adjusting her rhythm, pressing harder, forcing breaths, whispering words of life and determination. His eyes flickered, weakly tracking her movements, a fragile spark of consciousness. "Come on, sir," she whispered. "You're stronger than this. Fight with me. You're coming back." Daniels banked slightly, compensating for a sudden gust, guiding the plane toward the runway with trembling precision. The storm unleashed another violent gust, forcing the plane into a sharp, dangerous roll. Emily braced herself, compressions continuing without pause. Sweat poured down her face, soaking her uniform, but she refused to let exhaustion claim her. Reynolds coughed weakly, a faint sound, but enough to ignite hope. "That's it," Emily encouraged, pressing harder. "Stay awake. Not yet, not now. We're almost safe." Hydraulic warnings continued to flash, ominous and unrelenting. Daniels adjusted levers and toggles with desperate precision, compensating for the failing system. The engines roared, the fuselage shuddered, and lightning illuminated the cockpit in blinding flashes. Each flash revealed Emily's determination etched across her sweat-streaked face, the captain's fragile pulse beneath her hands, and the co-pilot's desperate concentration on the controls. The plane dipped again as turbulence struck, forcing Daniels to make rapid corrections. Emily rotated Reynolds slightly, adjusted the oxygen mask, and continued compressions with unrelenting focus. Every second was a tightrope walk between life and death. Outside, rain lashed the windows, the runway lights flickering faintly through the storm, a distant promise of safety that still felt unreachable. Minutes stretched into a surreal eternity. Emily's arms shook violently from exertion, yet she remained steadfast, compressions unwavering. The captain's pulse had strengthened but was still weak, each heartbeat a fragile thread between survival and oblivion. She whispered constantly, coaxing him to consciousness, speaking words filled with authority, hope, and raw emotion. "You're alive. Keep fighting. We're almost there. I need you awake. I need you here." Daniel's voice rose over the storm. "Runway in sight. Prepare for landing." Emily adjusted Reynolds one final time, ensuring his airway remained open and oxygen flowing. Each breath, each pulse was a lifeline, fragile but sufficient. She pressed harder on his chest, guiding his heartbeat, willing him to stay with her. Outside, the storm raged, wind gusts threatening to throw them off course, yet the runway lights grew steadily larger, a narrow path through chaos. The plane shuddered violently, pitching sharply as turbulence hit one final, punishing wave. Daniels adjusted frantically, yoke trembling in his hands. Emily braced herself, compressions relentless. Reynolds groaned weakly, his pulse now just strong enough to suggest survival. "That's it," she whispered fiercely, leaning closer. "Fight with me. Almost there. Stay awake." The engines roared, the fuselage trembled, and for a moment it felt as though the storm itself was testing their resolve, challenging every ounce of courage and skill. Finally, the runway lights filled the windshield, growing larger with every heartbeat. Daniels lined up the plane, careful, precise, every movement deliberate. Emily continued compressions, whispering encouragement, monitoring Reynolds' weak but steady pulse. The passengers, oblivious to the true miracle unfolding, gripped armrests and prayed, their fear mingling with a growing sense of hope as the plane descended steadily toward the runway. The first touch of wheels on the wet tarmac sent a shudder through the fuselage. Emily's arms burned, but she continued compressions, guiding the captain's heartbeat, urging him to remain conscious. Daniels navigated the final stretch, brakes and rudder compensating for rain-slicked pavement, engines roaring in defiance of the storm. Each second was a battle, each movement critical. Outside, lightning flashed one last time, illuminating the plane in stark, surreal brilliance. Finally, the plane rolled steadily, tires screaming against the tarmac as Daniels fought to keep it centered. Emily leaned over Reynolds, monitoring pulse and breathing, whispering encouragement. "You're alive. You're here. Almost safe, almost." The plane slowed, hydraulics warning lights still flickering but no longer threatening immediate disaster. The storm raged around them, but inside, a fragile rhythm of survival had been maintained, a miracle woven from courage, skill, and sheer human will. Passengers erupted in cautious relief, some crying, some cheering, yet the cockpit remained a zone of intense focus. Emily's hands pressed rhythmically, every breath, every pulse guiding Reynolds back to consciousness. His eyelids fluttered, gaze weak but returning, a faint acknowledgement of life. Daniels maneuvered the plane to a complete stop, engines idling, brakes holding firm against the wet tarmac. The emergency lights blinked, casting a soft glow on Emily's exhausted, determined face. Emily leaned back slightly, muscles screaming from exertion, and allowed herself a brief glance at the captain. His pulse was steady, breathing more regular, weak but alive. Relief surged, but she remained vigilant. One misstep could still undo the fragile balance they had achieved. The storm continued outside, wind and rain thrashing, yet inside the cockpit, life had been wrested from the brink. Reynolds' faint but steady pulse was a testament to human will and courage. And in that suspended, breathless moment, Flight 482 had survived. The captain, the passengers, and the crew remained intact, saved by the courage of a single nurse who refused to let life slip away. Emily's hands, still trembling from exertion, rested lightly on Reynolds' chest. She whispered softly, fiercely, "You made it. Stay with me. You're alive." Outside, the storm raged, indifferent and relentless, but inside a miracle had unfolded, a testament to endurance, skill, and unwavering resolve. The plane sat on the tarmac, engines idling, rain still lashing against the fuselage as though reminding everyone that survival had not come easily. The storm raged outside, but inside Flight 482, a fragile calm had settled, a tense, miraculous quiet after the chaos. Emily's hands, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, finally lifted from Captain Reynolds' chest. He lay weakly back, eyes fluttering, chest rising steadily with each careful breath. Alive. Against impossible odds, alive. Daniels leaned back in his seat, exhaling shakily, hands still trembling on the yoke. His voice broke as he whispered, We did it." Emily gave him a brief nod, still focused on Reynolds, refusing to let relief pull her attention too soon. Every instinct screamed vigilance. The storm might have passed outside the plane, but the captain's recovery was still delicate, a fragile thread connecting life and death. Passengers erupted into cautious cheers, tears streaking faces, phones capturing the final moments of their harrowing journey. Flight attendants moved quickly, securing loose items, checking on injured or shaken passengers, their voices still carrying urgency despite the relief. Yet none of them understood the full extent of what had occurred in the cockpit. A miraculous rescue, the life of their captain restored through sheer determination, skill, and courage. Emily leaned over Reynolds, monitoring his pulse and breathing, whispering encouragement. "You're alive, sir. You made it. Stay with me." His eyes fluttered open fully, confusion and recognition washing over him. "Emily?" he croaked, voice weak, raspy from oxygen deprivation. She nodded, a small, exhausted smile breaking through her sweat-streaked face. "Yes, you're here, you're safe now, breathe." For a moment, they were silent, connected by the unspoken bond of survival and the intensity of the life-saving struggle they had shared. Medical personnel were already on standby, rushing toward the plane once it had stopped. Paramedics and EMTs moved swiftly through the rain, boarding the aircraft with stretchers, oxygen tanks, and equipment. Emily coordinated quickly, briefing them on Reynolds' status. Pulse stabilized, breathing steady, weak but conscious. They nodded, professionalism tempered with awe, understanding that every second of the captain's survival had been hard-won at high altitude in the cockpit. Daniels exhaled again, voice quieter this time, almost reverent. "I've flown through storms, emergencies, turbulence, even mechanical failures, but I've never seen anything like that." Emily shook her head slightly, exhausted, still monitoring Reynolds. "It wasn't me," she murmured. "It was us. Every decision, every second, it all mattered. And he fought with us." Her voice carried humility, awe, and fatigue, but also the quiet triumph of someone who had stared death in the eye and refused to blink. Paramedics gently lifted Reynolds onto a stretcher, carefully transferring him with precision. Emily accompanied them, still holding his hand, whispering softly, "You're going to be okay. Stay with me. You've got this." Each step down the aisle was slow, deliberate, every movement a precaution. Reynolds' pulse remained stable, slightly stronger with each moment, and his weak but conscious eyes tracked Emily, a mixture of gratitude, awe, and lingering fear. Passengers watched in stunned silence, the scale of the miracle dawning on them. Tear-streaked faces, hands clutched tightly, some leaning forward in disbelief. Emily moved past them, guiding Reynolds with unwavering focus. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, rain pounding the fuselage, wind whipping. Yet inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had ended. One of fear, terror, and uncertainty transformed into triumph, relief, and awe. Outside, emergency vehicles lined the runway, lights flashing against the gray, rain-swept backdrop. Paramedics swiftly moved Reynolds from the plane to an awaiting ambulance. Emily stayed at his side until the final transfer, whispering words of reassurance. "You fought and you survived. That's what matters. You're going to be okay." His weak hand reached for hers briefly, a silent gesture of gratitude, recognition, and connection forged in the crucible of near-death and human resolve. The captain was finally secure in the ambulance, and Emily stepped back, breathing heavily, every muscle aching, every nerve still charged with adrenaline. Daniels came up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You saved him. Every second, every breath, you saved him." Emily let out a long, exhausted sigh, nodding slowly. "We all saved him, but I won't lie, I thought I'd lose him." Her voice cracked, but the faintest smile appeared. A mixture of relief, pride, and lingering tension from the ordeal. News crews arrived, capturing the dramatic scene. The storm still raging, the plane on the tarmac, emergency vehicles flashing, and the small figure of Emily, soaked and exhausted, standing as a testament to human courage. Passengers recounted the chaos, the fear, and finally, the miraculous outcome. Yet the true heroism had unfolded silently in the cockpit. A nurse who refused to yield to exhaustion or fear, whose hands, courage, and determination had held life together against impossible odds. Reynolds, finally stabilized in the ambulance, gave Emily a faint, grateful smile. I owe you my life," he whispered, voice weak but sincere. Emily shook her head, exhausted tears spilling over her cheeks. "No, you fought too. We fought together. That's how you're alive." For a moment, the storm outside and the chaos of the world outside the plane faded into insignificance. Inside, only the quiet, powerful resonance of survival remained. The ambulance drove off toward the hospital, rain still falling in sheets, wind still shrieking, yet the terror and suspense of Flight 482 had transformed into something else entirely: relief, awe, and the lingering thrill of survival. Emily watched until it disappeared into the distance, heart still racing, adrenaline still surging. She turned back toward the plane, toward the passengers who had survived the storm, toward the small, human victories that had unfolded in the eye of chaos. And as the rain finally began to taper, the storm easing into a gray, trembling calm, Emily allowed herself the faintest smile. The flight crew had survived, the passengers were safe, and the captain, against all odds, was alive. The world felt impossibly fragile, yet for one brief shining moment, human courage had bent the rules of fate. The story of Flight 482 of Captain Reynolds and of the nurse who refused to give up would ripple across memories, cameras, and headlines. But more importantly, it would remain etched in the hearts of those who had witnessed survival at its rawest, most heroic form. As she finally allowed herself to breathe, Emily felt the weight of every heartbeat, every compressed second, every flicker of life she had fought to preserve. And in that quiet aftermath, she realized something powerful. Courage was not always loud. It was not always acknowledged. But when it mattered most, at the very edge of life and death, it was unstoppable. And for Flight 482, it had been enough. The storm may have raged, the storm may have tested them, but the storm had lost to human determination. And somewhere deep within her chest, Emily knew one unshakable truth. No matter the odds, life could be wrested from the brink. One heartbeat, one breath, one unyielding human hand at a time.